Hello, glad to see you on my channel. I really value it. And today I want to share with you a wonderful story. It's a dramatic story that will come as a total shock to everybody. It is a really amazing story. So enjoy watching it. Spinning in front of the mirror, Alice smiled to herself and said, I should definitely be hired. I should definitely be hired. But that day she was going for an interview at Magnolia Restaurant, where Pablo was the director and owner. There were rumors about him in town that he had connections in criminal circles, and some claimed that he himself was a bandit, and the restaurant was, one might say, for a penny. Knowing this, Alice decided to waitress there anyway. She had everything she needed: good looks, an intelligent manner, and sufficient knowledge of the restaurant business. In addition, she was less picky about her salary. At her previous job, she had often been underpaid, and Alice was comfortable with that. She only left because she had a change of manager who started to punish everyone without any reason. Naturally, work began among her subordinates, and then she resigned. Alice held out until the very last, but her nerves finally gave out, too. She wrote her resignation and immediately left the company, and she didn't regret it at all, because it soon went bankrupt. She jumped out of the bus like a butterfly and crossed the road, and found herself outside a white two-story building. She looked at the beautiful stucco and decorative stained glass windows, walked to the door, and took hold of the handle and opened it. A man in his 30s walked toward her and said hello. How do you do? I am glad to greet you in our restaurant. How do you do? I'm very glad to hear it, but I'm here about my work. The man changed his face as if he had eaten a lemon and answered grudgingly, Come. You are on the second floor. Alice obediently followed him up the carved oak steps. They did not creak as they usually did, but on the contrary, they masked all sound. As she stepped on them, she did not even hear her own footsteps. It was as if she was not walking, but flying. Finally, the man led her to a door, also of oak, and knocked. Pablo, it's for you, about the job. Let them come in. I am on the telephone. The girl went into the office and sat down on a chair near the massive oak table. While the director was talking to someone, she managed to see a few pictures on the walls and a massive safe in the corner. These metal boxes usually held important documents or money. When she had finished talking on the phone, the first thing the director asked was, Have you ever worked in a restaurant? No. But I do have some knowledge in the field, she replied timidly. Come on, stand up and spin around. Alice got up from her chair and twirled. As she did so, her dress fluttered like a light blanket. Making a satisfied face, the owner of the establishment said, Well, not bad. I like it, you're accepted. What about the job interview, said Alice hesitantly. You passed the interview. There's no need for questions. The director nodded. I can see that you are a good girl. You are decently dressed, and your appearance is quite appropriate. I get it from my mother, she answered happily. It is very good. So your mom is pretty too, the manager said. So starting tomorrow you can start work. But keep in mind you will have a probationary period. And just try not to justify my trust. The last word sounded like a threat, but the waitress paid no attention to it. She wanted to work here, and all warnings from the director seemed to her to be a production necessity at the company where she had worked before, which had gone bankrupt. There, too, she had heard threats on more than one occasion. However, no one ever brought them to life, no matter how they sounded. And now, hearing similar words, she was not at all frightened. On the contrary, she was even inspired and received a powerful charge of energy, because the director did not conduct the interview, which meant that he was satisfied with everything. With these thoughts, she said goodbye to Pablo and left his office. The director looked after her and, like a March cat, licked his teeth. It seemed that when she was spinning around in front of him, he had seen and appreciated her from all sides. And it was quite understandable why he did not set up an interview, but immediately hired her. As she descended to the first floor, Alice again walked past the man who had greeted her at the entrance. Now he was smiling. Apparently he guessed that the girl had been hired. After waving goodbye to him, she went outside and headed for the bus stop. She also had to buy some groceries on the way. She sat down on the seat beside the driver and immediately remembered what had happened in the past. The joy of being hired was replaced by hard thinking. She had spent part of her childhood within the walls of the orphanage, but before that she had lived with her mother. She never saw her father because he ran away, not even officially married or waiting for the birth of a child. Emily, the mother, was 8 months pregnant at the time when Paul disappeared from work and then quit his job and was never seen again in town. So Emily was left alone with a baby in her arms and with vague prospects for the future. Her mother had no profession or trade, so she took a job as a cleaner in a roadside inn. She had to work almost 16 hours a day to make ends meet, and she worked with the understanding that she could only rely on herself. Looking at her mother's hard work, her daughter, when she was 8 years old, began to help out around the house, doing what she could and could do. But even for that, her mother was grateful. Coming home late at night, Emily saw a clean apartment and sandwiches on the table. That was all her beloved daughter could do. Meanwhile, quite unexpectedly, Emily was diagnosed with diabetes. She didn't say anything. Alice, not to upset her. Her daughter was a very impressionable girl and could react inappropriately. Emily was afraid that the girl would panic and cry all the time. No, that was something her mother could not allow. And so, as much as she had the strength and patience, she hid everything to the last. She had to work hard. She had fainted a couple of times at work. It was good that the director did not see, or she would have been fired in a jiffy. In addition, there was always a partner who was sympathetic to Emily. She helped her out when she had to go to the hospital. In fact, the girl didn't even know what was happening to her mother. The daughter thought she was fine, just a little tired, so she tried to put everything in order at home, so her mother at least didn't waste time on it. But one day, Emily's body couldn't take it, and she was hospitalized in intensive care with a coma. A neighbor who often helped them promised to take care of the girl. The classroom door opened abruptly and the vice principal looked in. She looked at Alice and asked her to come out. They had a serious conversation in the hallway, from which the girl learned that her mother had been taken to the hospital in serious condition. Running back into the classroom, she gathered her books into her briefcase and left the school. She walked to the medical facility. There they did not want to let her see her mother, but then they took pity on her and accompanied her to the intensive care unit. However, they wouldn't let her inside, and only showed her through the glass where the patient lay. Alice looked at her mother hooked up to various machines and wept. Tears were rolling down her face in a hail of her cheek. At that moment she clearly understood what had happened to her, a terrible misfortune, and she had no illusions about her mother's recovery. All the more so, and the doctor, who came up behind her, whispered softly, "Be strong, baby girl. I feel for you." What did his words mean? It was clear. But it took the girl a few days to find out. All the time she'd been coming to the hospital after school to check on her mother and bring sandwiches, but they were not taken, saying that there was nothing wrong with the food here. She silently put everything back and looked again through the glass at her sleeping mother. It seemed to her that just a little longer and she would wake up. But no, coming back to the hospital again, the girl saw the same picture. Mom was lying with her eyes closed, and only the machine constantly signaled that there was still life in her. That day, she got the highest score in math and rushed to the hospital to share her joy with her mother. She hoped the doctors would let her see her, but when she entered the hospital, she was greeted by the staff with frowning faces. The nurses were literally hugging the girl and crying. Not understanding what was happening, Alice tried to break free to go to the intensive care unit. Finally, the doctor came out and informed her that her mother was gone. The girl collapsed on the floor and wept. The joy of the evaluation immediately faded and was replaced by the same panic Emily had been worried about. But now it looked like hysteria and uncontrollable. The nurses had to take the child to the room to give her a sedative and try to bring her to her senses. However, she didn't want to calm down and kept sobbing. They spent more than an hour beating her until she stopped crying. The girl got up from the bed on which they had laid her and stared at one point. For several minutes she stared at the wall and, keeping her eyes on it, whispered something to herself, quietly moving her lips. None of the nurses could understand what the girl wanted to say. They just looked at Alice and sighed heavily. Finally, the girl came to her senses and said loudly, "I have to go home." One of the nurses volunteered to accompany her so that God forbid something might happen to her on the way. In 20 minutes, they walked together to a small 4-story house. A woman immediately looked out of a window on the 3rd floor. She shouted the girl's name. The girl recognized her, waved, and said she would be right up. Then she thanked the nurse and disappeared into the entryway. Looking at the woman who kept looking out of the window, the nurse nodded her head and asked her to keep a close eye on her for the first time. The neighbor promised that she would not take one step away from the child. From that day on, it could be said that the girl began her adult life. The Board of Trustees, despite the fact that she was not alone, took her away and sent her to an orphanage. So at the age of 10, she found herself an orphan, with many more difficult trials ahead of her. She learned a lot at the orphanage. First of all, about survival. It is not to say that she was treated badly at all, but sometimes she had to stand up for herself. At such moments, she steeled her character and learned to endure pain. She understood that no one would pat anyone on the head. Meanwhile, her apartment was not empty. Tenants lived there, a neighbor rented to them, and the money was sent to Alice's account opened in the bank by the Board of Trustees. When she grew up, she left the orphanage and returned to her home. With the money she had saved from renting the apartment, she was able to live for a while and look for work. She also used it to pay for the installation of the monument on her mother's grave and to buy herself some clothes and shoes and some furniture. The rest of the money she had left was enough to eat, but it was not enough to go about her business. The girl could make do with very little, so it was Prudence spent the money. After she was laid off from the factory, she had to economize on everything. And when a job in a restaurant came along, she breathed a sigh of relief, especially since she was going to work as a waitress. The position of a cleaner she had not even considered, all because it brought back sad memories of her mother. Alina sinned that if she did not plow like the damned for 16 hours a day, perhaps so prematurely died. But that was just her speculation. After all, she didn't really know if her mother had diabetes. Until then, Emily had never shown her pain, all kept to herself, that her daughter did not see anything. And it turned out that Alice had also followed in his footsteps. She, too, was patient even if it hurt a lot. The orphanage had taught her to keep her mouth shut and not show her suffering. Alice learned these lessons for a long time, and they soon came in handy. As for her personal life, it did not work out for her. No one particularly wanted to get acquainted, and if it happened, and they were mostly rogues, she could spot them as soon as they had anything at all to do with each other. Most of the time they asked for money, creating situations where they were to be pitied. Learning to spot these kinds of scams, she did not get acquainted with all in a row. And when she realized that no other options were in sight, she gave up all attempts to establish a personal life. When she got home, she cooked a modest dinner and had a snack. She did not feel like watching TV, so she grabbed a book from the shelf. She had a lot of them left over from her mother. Emily liked to read when she had free time. She spent a couple of hours before going to bed trying to figure out the mystery of a medieval castle. She was so engrossed in it that she didn't notice how her eyes began to fall asleep. Putting the book aside, Alice made her bed and went to sleep. At night, she dreamt of her mother, who wanted to warn her about something. She was wagging her finger and whispering something about strangers and fears. The girl could not make out what her mother was warning her about. She tried to do so, but her subconscious mind stubbornly masked the picture. In the end, when she woke up in the morning, she was unable to piece together what she had seen in the dream. Smiling at her reflection in the mirror, she washed and cleaned herself up, and then, after a quick breakfast, she went to work. As expected, she was greeted rather coldly in the team. Apparently, none of them wanted to see a new waitress. And all because in this restaurant rich customers paid good tips. And naturally, no one wanted to share. So they treated her with a kind of contempt, hoping she wouldn't last long and quit. However, they miscalculated. The girl was not going to back down. On the contrary, the new waitress decided to go all the way. She wanted the job, and not only because of the money, but also because she wanted to prove to herself that she was capable of any challenge. Meanwhile, taunts reverberated throughout the staff. The other waiters and waitresses were not shy about mocking and teasing her. She steadfastly held her ground and did not succumb to provocation. At the orphanage, she learned the brick walls method well. One of the foster children, who was 3 years older, explained to her at the time what to do if they were really bothering her. Alice used this advice, and she was able to level all the taunts and bullying. That's how she made it through her 1-month probationary period. After evaluating her performance, the director ordered her to be promoted from intern to full waitress. A new phase began. She had to be able to serve as many customers as possible. This was fully reflected in her salary. Pablo occasionally slipped money to the staff if they did a good job, but only to people he thought were his own favorites. At the same time, to avoid wasting lunches, Alice would go across the street and buy herself a muffin and a juice. She knew how to count her money, so if she had a chance to save money, she took it. During her work, she studied all the options where she could get a cheap snack, and after several checks, she stopped at the only kiosk. An elderly Armenian man worked there, selling not only freshly baked goods, but also several kinds of meat delicacies. The vendor's name was Ali. He got so used to the girl over the course of a few days that as soon as he saw her walking toward the kiosk, he would immediately prepare a bun and juice. Sometimes, however, he would slip pastries to her for a hearty meal, and he would not take money for them, refusing even change. Naturally, the waitress was glad that she was able to have such a hearty snack, as there were no free lunches in the restaurant. The director did not think it necessary to feed the staff because he was worried about revenue. Meanwhile, the rest of the workers were surviving on meager meals from home and leftovers from visitors. The new girl neither took nor bought anything from the restaurant. It was expensive, and she simply could not afford the dishes that were on the menu. Besides, she didn't want to give herself a reputation as a dishonest employee. She saw how reverent the director was about any expense, and she didn't want to incur his wrath. Sometimes he allowed himself to yell at the waiters if they did something wrong. After working for a couple more weeks, Alice realized that she wasn't going to be tipped. As it turned out, the director had personally instructed her to take them into the common piggy bank. Without thinking twice, she asked him herself, "Pablo, am I doing a bad job?" "No, on the contrary, it's okay. I am fine." "Then why don't they give me my share of the tips?" Alice continued. "Well, you are just getting used to the team," said the director. "When you work a little more, then we'll see." "And how long will it last?" stood her ground. "I think not more than a month or two," answered Pablo. "In the meantime, your share will go into the pot." The girl had to put up with it because she did not want to spoil relations with him. The director could have fired her, and then she would have to look for a new job. After figuring that a couple of months wouldn't be too long, she decided not to stutter about tips anymore. She'd seen the other waiters get their tips at the end of their shifts, but she didn't show that she was offended. Hiding her anger deep in her soul, she continued to work and at the same time understood that this was pure robbery. The director had no moral right to do this to her. In addition, she learned that he did not pinch tips on all the waiters. Some of them started getting their share within the first month. It turned out that the boss was selective in his treatment of the staff. Hence the favorites who were never punished for anything. All in all, it was similar to what she had encountered when she was brought up in an orphanage. There, too, there were favorites, and their caretakers did not touch them. On the contrary, encouraged them in every way and set an example to others. They were even allowed to go outside the orphanage, and nobody asked them afterwards where they had been. And if they were caught smelling of liquor or tobacco, they got away with it. She distinctly remembered being punished for their antics by the other inmates. She was in trouble too. But she kept silent, knowing that if she started complaining, it would be even worse. A month flew by unnoticed in the rhythm of her work. With pity, the director allowed her to give her part of the tip. The rest of the money she was entitled to still went into the pool. As a result, the director's favorites got richer. They were the ones who got the most part of the tips they earned. No one tried to argue with that for fear of ending up on the street. Alice decided not to tempt fate either, and was thankful that at least she was getting some. As she frequented the kiosk where the vendor gave her a treat, one day she found an unusual vagrant there. He was sitting on sheets of cardboard looking like an important customer and looking around. He seemed quite comfortable because the tramp didn't swear or try to surround himself with a pile of clothes for comfort. He did not look more than 30. However, the gray on his head and temples indicated that he had had many unpleasant experiences in his life. In addition, unlike the other tramps she sometimes met, he did not have a lot of nerve, did not throw himself at people, asking them for money and in general. Behaved modestly and quietly. He did not seem to have come here for alms at all. Alice, while she was eating a bun, saw several people walk past him, and some of them threw some change into the box. The tramp thanked them, lowering his head, but not getting up to ask for anything more. When she met his eyes, she saw a sea of sadness and melancholy in his eyes. It was said of such people that they were desperate and ready for any feats. Despite the fact that he was a tramp, the man watched himself. He only had a small stubble, and it indicated that he periodically shaved. Opening her purse, she took out a small bill and handed it to him. He cautiously took the piece of paper from her hands and said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you, kind girl, and may God bless you." Alice stepped aside and, nodding her head in response, folded her palms together. This way she let him know that she did it from her heart. At that moment, the alley salesman held up his thumb and winked at the young waitress. Smiling, she gave the tramp some more food and went back to the restaurant herself. Already near the entrance, she stopped for a moment, turned around the kiosk, and caught herself thinking that this tramp was sympathetic to her. And even though he was on the street because of life circumstances, he was still a human being. That was important because some of the tramps, if not half of them, were sometimes aggressive, not just asking for alms, but demanding to be given money. According to them, everyone had turned against them, so they had to hit rock bottom. Some justified their vagrancy by the fact that it suited them to live among the filth and humiliation. There were some homeless people too, but they all shunned large crowds of people. They had well-developed instincts for self-preservation. That was why they were seldom seen in the market, where the peddlers would chase the vagrants to the ground and spare no physical force to humiliate them even more. The beggar's fate was not well regarded by society, all because there was little reason for mercy. Alice finished her shift later that day because there were many visitors. When she arrived home, she cooked dinner, as usual, but she did not eat right away. The image of that very tramp suddenly appeared before her eyes. He was smiling broadly, and his eyes shone like the lanterns of a night city. Alice couldn't understand why. But then it dawned on her. It was her feelings that were making itself felt. For the first time, she found herself in a position where the fire of love inside her had been lit. She had never seen anything like it before. Not with any guy she'd ever dated before, anyway. Had there really been a man who had lit that fire inside her? She couldn't believe it. She suddenly had a craving for sweet tea. There was a convenience store not far from her house. Quickly dressed again, she ran down there and bought a cake. Alice enjoyed the dessert carefully with a teaspoon, taking in the cream and sponge. She was washing it all down with sweet tea. At that moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down. The girl could not accept the fact that she was in love. Yes, that was the feeling when butterflies fluttered in her stomach. Her heart beat faster and she wanted to jump for joy. At night, she twisted for a long time until she finally fell asleep. In the morning, when she arrived at the restaurant, Alice was literally flying between the tables. Naturally, the customers were happy because their orders were taken very quickly. The other waiters also kept up, but they still could not serve the guests so skillfully, and they could not understand what was going on with their colleague. And when the director saw it, he had an ironic thought flash through his head. There you love your job. You don't even have to pay the tip. At lunchtime, she came back for a snack at the clerk's. Her mood was high, and he cautiously asked, "What, did you get a bonus for good work?" "No, just my soul is singing," replied Alice cheerfully. The tramp was sitting in his new place eating something. When he saw his benefactress, he winked at her and waved. The girl took the bun and the juice and, approaching him, took out her purse again and handed her the bill. Putting his hands together, the tramp bowed low. At the same time, he was unaware that she was having money problems and was giving him almost her last. Alice felt sorry for the boy, understanding how hard it was for him now. If it weren't for the shelter, the roommate's support, and this job, she might have been there for him, too. After finishing his lunch, the tramp got up from his cardboard, put it away, and headed for the park. And she thought he had decided to beg there. But the alley salesman only shook his head and responded regretfully. "He likes swans on the pond. I saw him feeding them. Poor man, he lost everything in life, but his kindness remained." She suddenly wondered who he was and where he had come from. Ali ran his hand over his black beard and began to tell her. It turned out that this vagabond had only recently come to these parts. His name was Oliver. At least that was what he had told him. It was also said that in the past the tramp had lived differently, not as he did now. Raising his index finger upward, Ali added, "This is what happens to those who go astray." Indeed, from the outside it looked as if the tramp had lost his way. He had no desire to change anything, at least not in the time she had seen him here. He had done nothing to get to the surface and become a different person. A reasonable question arose. What was stopping him? One might assume a lack of motivation. But when a person was in a difficult situation, he still tried to find a way out of it, at least when he was this young. Oliver, if that was his real name, was adrift. Pondering this, the waitress sat down on a bench and began to eat a bun with some juice. After a couple of minutes, the tramp reappeared. He held some change in his hand and counted it briskly. He approached the kiosk, poured the coins into a saucer, and asked for coffee. While I was feeding the swans, I collected some. "Did people serve it?" Ali asked, pouring coffee into a plastic cup. No. I found them on the ground, under the bench or near the pond." Shaking his head, the tramp answered. After getting his coffee, he squatted down next to the bench. Alice looked him straight in the eyes and smiled involuntarily. The guy winked back and immediately blushed. It was obvious that the emotion came over him too, as if his heart felt positive energy from the girl. After finishing her impromptu lunch, the waitress got up from the bench, said goodbye to everyone, and went to work. During her shift, she returned more than once to the moment when the tramp first winked at her. She got the impression that he was not at all despondent about his situation. Many a wanderer and beggar had fallen to the bottom of social status. But he did not. He bore all the hardships of life calmly and looked to the future with confidence. Alice suddenly remembered herself as a child when her mother did not, and she was placed in an orphanage. She, too, did not lose heart, even though she knew that she was deprived of everything. In all the years spent within the walls of that institution, she dreamed only of returning home as soon as possible. At the same time, Alice could not help but understand that in an empty apartment she would have to make her own life on her own. And she would never hear from anyone else again. "Good morning, daughter." The man who had held the family home together with her mother was no longer there, as it seemed to her at the time. Part of their lives was gone. Trips to the kiosk for a muffin and juice. Now it was more than just lunch for her. She couldn't go a day without seeing that tramp. The salesman even began to suspect that Alice only came to him for him, and one day, unable to stand it straight with her, he asked her about it. "Say, Oliver, you must like him." "I don't know," she laughed. "I don't know," she laughed. "Well, it can't be. Either you like him or you don't," I answered clearly and without hesitation. "Here, if you like a girl or a guy, you say so to your face. We never walk around." "Yeah, around. Yeah, around. Yeah, that's right," laughing, Alice answered. "And we don't have those doubts. The heart says everything," Ali said, putting his palm to his left breast. "I agree with you on that. But I still need to find out how I feel." The girl concluded the conversation. "You see for yourself. You know best," he answered. "In the meantime, have some cake. I made it myself." Alice took the dessert platter from him and sat down on the bench. Tramp was gone for the moment. It looked like he was feeding the swans on the pond again, and when he returned, Alice was already leaving. Looking after her, Oliver smiled slightly and walked over to the kiosk. Ali poured a hot drink into a cup and said cautiously, "You are a lucky man." Ali did not explain what this meant, and the tramp did not dare to ask him about it, knowing that he had enough to do without him. Meanwhile, the waitress, having returned to the restaurant, finally realized that she had fallen in love with the tramp, but she did not hurry to take concrete action. She needed to see if her heart was deceiving her. Besides, she wanted to wait for Oliver to make the first move himself. She guessed from his glances and winks and demeanor that the young man liked her, but he hesitated to say so. Apparently, he was afraid of something or someone. For 2 weeks, these fleeting meetings continued. The employee came to the kiosk for lunch, but the tramp was still sitting in his favorite place, and his behavior did not seem to change. He quietly watched passers-by and did not bother them with requests for money. At some point, the girl decided it was a mistaken crush. After all, they essentially made no moves toward each other. The tramp had even moved on to another site. Oliver could have walked away with an empty box, but it didn't upset him one bit. Alice began to suspect that he had some other goals than vagrancy. But soon there were changes in her life that made her forget the tramp for a while. It all started when a large sum of money went missing from the principal's safe. No one knew exactly how much, but you could tell from his angry, hysterical demeanor that it was very, very much. Pablo was metal and trying to find the missing money. He suspected all his subordinates, but he had no obvious clues. Even his guards were knocked off their feet trying to figure out the thief. In the restaurant organized a total inspection of the belongings of all employees, and the girl did not escape this fate, but she was not in the habit of taking things, let alone money, so they did not find anything on her. The other waiters also turned out to be clean. The director was furious. He didn't know what to do or how to return the stolen money. He left for a few days and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. His assistant stayed to take care of the restaurant, but he was not so strict with the staff. The waitress even started to receive her full share of the tips, and it seemed as if it would last forever, at least until the director came back. Thunder rumbled when the boss brought in a computer technician who, at his request, installed hidden cameras everywhere. But where exactly they were, none of the staff, except the guards, knew. They were trusted by the director and even assigned to do the dirty work. Alice often noticed strange people being brought into his office and then almost crawling out of there. It was rumored that the director tortured competitors and those who crossed his path. Apparently, he was not afraid of justice, because he must have been in bed with them. Law enforcement officers of high rank were often seen among the regular visitors. It was all in plain sight, and any of the restaurant employees knew who was coming in. They even had a clear division of who to tip and who it was better to stay away from. The stuffed and feted customers, whom the director knew personally, did not give tips. They did not even pay for their orders, and none of the staff dared argue and demand money, because they could immediately get kicked out of their jobs. She learned all the black noise by heart and exercised maximum caution in dealing with them, but soon began a complete scuffle with the money that disappeared from the director's safe. Employees began to suspect each other of treason because, purely theoretically, each of them could steal. True, to prove it was impossible because there was no evidence on the spot. It was as if the work was done by a real professional. Somehow he managed to seize the moment and sneak up to the second floor unnoticed, and this despite the fact that the guards were always on guard. Something about this didn't add up. Alice knew in her gut that none of the employees had taken the money, but how to find out the truth she did not know. She was not going to do her own investigation. Trying to get to the truth, she unnoticeably became the object of surveillance. The guards found out that she often went to the kiosk and talked there with a salesman and a vagrant. For the time being, they turned a blind eye to this, understanding that communication between a waitress and a beggar and a vendor at the kiosk was not illegal. Moreover, they could not accuse her of stealing either. There was no evidence. She worked honestly and never took anything from the kitchen, where there was always untouched food from the customers. At the same time, other employees did not hesitate to take out the delicacies, and did it so slyly that the guards did not suspect anything. However, the director decided to run checks after his shift. He required all staff to empty their pockets and bags before leaving work. The taking out of delicacies and meals stopped temporarily. No one wanted to get caught up in it and get kicked out right away. As the saying goes, money was more precious than food, and it wasn't worth the risk. And it didn't concern the waitress, so she wasn't afraid of checks. She had nothing with her that could compromise her. When she came home, she still cooked a modest dinner. Sometimes she gave up meat altogether and ate only vegetables. She wasn't on a diet. She was just giving her body a break. She even considered getting a puppy or kitten to make her evenings more interesting. But when she thought about the amount of time she had to spend at work, she gave up the idea. On the other hand, she felt sorry for the animals, abandoned by their negligent owners. They used to sit on Alice, was a little girl who was on the porch and looked at her with hungry eyes. Alice tried to give them something to eat if possible. Here, of course, was where the unclaimed food from the restaurant could come in handy. But, remembering what the manager had arranged, she didn't dare do that. The girl asked Ali for leftovers, and the kiosk clerk went to her and poured them into a pile. But such generous gifts did not always happen. That is why sometimes the girl would throw up her hands as she walked past the animals near the stairway. But her heart couldn't bear it, and she, immediately having eaten, hurried to give them bones or something from the rest of her dinner. After everyone in the restaurant began to suspect each other, the situation at all heated to the limit. In such conditions, it was simply impossible to work properly. And interestingly, the director did not even try to reduce the degree of tension. On the contrary, only added fuel to the fire, constantly pointing his finger at any of the waiters and whined, "I know that you stole. I'll destroy." Naturally, the staff trembled at his every appearance, and what has always been called whistleblowing began. Alice was in constant fear that the director might snap at her. After all, he had been somehow prejudiced against her in the beginning, especially knowing that she was an orphan, and that if anything happened, there would be no one to intercede for her, and orphans often arouse suspicion. The poor waitress had to walk in line so that she would not be criticized. Alice even took less time to go out to lunch, and she tolerated not eating all day and worked on an empty stomach, and all because she was afraid, what if they thought she was going out on purpose to sneak something out? In general, the restaurant was a mess. Everyone was trying to denounce his comrade, and the director listened to all this nonsense, but so far has not reacted. He pretended to be interested, but was really looking for the real thief. He was not a stupid man and understood. The staff was simply out of fear of denunciation. He did not believe because he did not want to punish an innocent man. At the same time, he really needed the missing money, most likely because he planned to use it to pay off powerful people. At least that is what it seemed to him from the outside. The fact was that he had been frequented lately by strange men in expensive suits and luxury cars. The search continued for another week, until the waitress fell into a cleverly laid snare's guards. They decided to go for broke when they realized that none of the employees do not intend to confess. Knowing that the girl had gone to the kiosk during lunch, they deliberately stopped her at the door. Obeying their demands, she opened her pockets, but there was nothing there, only a handkerchief. That's when the head of security demanded to check the locker where she was handed over. She calmly opened it, knowing that apart from her belongings there could be nothing else there. But how surprised was everyone present when a bundle of bills was found under the bottom shelf. But it wasn't all the money that was missing from the principal's safe. Finding was reported to the boss. He raced to the locker room and began to shake Alice. "You stole the money. Where's the rest of it?" The waitress was in a stupor and did not know what to answer. She was sure there was nothing unauthorized in her locker, and the whole check looked like a farce to compromise her. But here was the real money, which the director recognized. He looked at the bills in the bundle and shuddered. "I will destroy you. You have robbed and betrayed me." After the girl came out of her stupor, she tried to prove to him that she knew nothing about the money in the locker and kept saying that it wasn't there in the morning and how it got there. She didn't know. The boss had cooled down a bit. His hatred was gone, and he exhaled sharply and asked cautiously, "What am I going to do with you? What proof do you have that you didn't take them?" But no sooner had she responded than the head of security intervened in the conversation. He told the director that he had often seen her go out to the kiosk during lunchtime, and there chatting with the salesman and the vagabond. So what? It wasn't a crime. Pablo resented it. "But she also gave something to the tramp," the guard answered. "I saw it several times myself." "Now that is interesting. Bring that beggar to me at once," the headmaster commanded, and immediately looked at the girl with hatred. "In the meantime, you look for words of justification, so that I believe you or not." The three guards ran out of the restaurant and headed in the direction of the kiosk. When he saw the sturdy men, Ali decided it was up to him and hurried to close his stall. Although he had done nothing illegal, who could have known what these desperate men were capable of? However, the guards flew past the kiosk and ran up to the vagrant. He was sitting on the cardboard and didn't seem to be paying any attention to them at all. Oliver was daydreaming about something, making a thoughtful appearance. But as soon as he tried to tell them they were blocking his son, the guards grabbed him and dragged him into the restaurant. Meanwhile, it turned out where the hidden cameras were. The director just couldn't stand it when he swore and started showing the staff how he was watching them. And they were horrified when they found out that he had also seen what was going on in the locker room and the restaurant. Naturally, there was no limit to their indignation. But the director didn't seem to care at all. He was looking for his money and didn't give a damn about moral principles. Finally, the guards dragged the tramp into the restaurant and dragged him further to the second floor. Alice saw all this and wrung her hands, not knowing what to do. But what would she do against the director of his entourage? Nothing. She would just be laughed at, and perhaps even physical force would have been used. Interestingly enough, the tramp didn't even resist being dragged. He reacted calmly, as if he were in another reality altogether, only winking at her once before he found himself in the restaurant manager's office. He tried to shove the tramp, but he dodged and threw off his wig. It turned out that under the mask of a beggar, there was another man. Stunned by this trick with the wig, the director floundered in his chair. The guards wanted to twist the tramp again, but Oliver knocked them down with 2 blows. He wasn't as weak as some people thought. Stepping with his boot on the principal's foot, the beggar uttered, "What's up, bitch?" He recognized me. The principal squinted and almost screamed. The tramp took out his police badges and waved them in front of him. It turned out that it was the major whose pregnant wife had been killed by this bandit. The office door swung open, and Alice flew in. When she saw the guards on the floor, she nearly fainted, but the major managed to pick her up and sit her down on a chair, having previously chased the director out of there. Splashed water in her face, he brought the girl to her senses. The waitress looked once more at the guards, then at her boss, and only then did she ask what had happened here. The major ran his hand through her hair and calmly answered, I'm a policeman, former head of the Criminal Investigation Department." Showing her his credentials, he went on to tell her what all this masquerade was about. "The fact is that a few years ago, as head of the investigation, I got on the trail of a gang that dealt in illegal drugs. Andrew set up a surveillance of the ringleader and his gang. It was necessary to collect as much evidence as possible, but the most important thing was to catch the criminals red-handed. The major was clinging to every thread that could lead to evidence. After all, the gang was so tightly knit that its activities were difficult to detect. Every time they managed to slip away, as if they knew in advance that they were being raided. We had to bring in some serious resources to find out who might be leaking important information to the gang. Soon the major found out who one of the officers in the main directorate was. He was very high up, and it was hard to get to him easily. It required the involvement of additional forces and connections. But surprisingly, no one wanted to mess with him. Everyone valued their positions and were in no hurry to help the major. In the end, he was left in complete isolation because there was no one to rely on. And, at his own risk, Andrew decided to take on the gang himself. He devised a plan of operation to capture the criminals. The moment the goods were handed over, the raid was sudden, but they managed to get away. The leader of the gang somehow miraculously escaped justice. Most likely someone warned him, and it was probably the same officer from the main directorate. Now it was his turn. But suddenly, the colonel disappeared and never showed up at work. A search was put out for him. They sent out an app to all the police departments, but they didn't take into account the fact that during his service, he had provided himself with a reliable cover. The major unsuccessfully tried to find the officer, but in the meantime, his wife was getting ready to give birth. She was already 9 months pregnant. Andrew dusted her off, shaking her like a little baby. One weekend, they decided to go to the country for the last time before his wife had to go to the maternity hospital. They had a beautiful house there, which Andrew had built with his own hands. Having put his wife in the back seat, the major drove out of the yard. He did not press the gas so there would be no jolting. His wife kept reminding him of that. At a traffic light, he slowed down when the light turned red. But all of a sudden, there was a hard blow from behind, which sharply threw his car into the ditch. The driver didn't remember what happened further on, as he lost consciousness. The doctors arrived on the scene, stated that his wife and her unborn child had died, and the major was urgently hospitalized in a medical center. The doctors made every effort, but the coma incapacitated Andrew for several weeks. And while he was in that condition, his wife was buried. And when he came to, he found out that his wife was gone. With difficulty barely holding back tears, the policeman drove to the cemetery to say goodbye to his beloved. He spent almost an hour at her grave, kneeling and praying. It is possible that at that moment the Major was turning to God, asking him why he had taken his wife and unborn child. Naturally, he received no answer to his question. But he did receive accurate information about the accident. Surveillance cameras recorded that his car had been hit by a truck. The same ringleader was behind the wheel. An interception plan was organized, but it had no effect, and the criminal managed to escape. A little later, it turned out that there was another passenger in the truck, but his face was not caught on camera. Only his dark jacket was visible. Andrew assumed that it was the missing officer from the headquarters and set out to find them both at any cost. In order to do this, the Major resigned his position as head of the criminal investigation. In agreement with the management, he was transferred to another department. His boss there was a good acquaintance, and he gave his permission for him to take a leave of absence on his own account when the need arose. After the unfortunate accident, the accomplices fled the city. The former gang leader changed his location and even made himself a fake ID. So he became Pablo, and with the money he had managed to take with him, he bought the premises and set up a restaurant in it. Maybe he would have lived happily ever after, as an honest businessman, if Andrew hadn't come after him. It happened after the Major had carried out a titanic operational and investigative work. He had to use all available means to find criminals without any documents or witnesses. Andrew questioned the gang members with vigor, and unable to withstand the pressure, one of them confessed that they had a safe house. He even named the city to look for it. So the Major ended up here. It is true that for a while he had to follow Pablo until it turned out that he was the same ringleader, and Drew was forced to become a vagrant in order not to draw attention to himself. For a long time he was gathering information and watching the restaurant. And then one day a missing officer from the headquarters, a colonel accompanied by some man, arrived. Everything fell into place. There could be no doubt. This was where the gang's lair was. It was during that period that Alice had also met him. So as not to derail the whole operation, he played the tramp to the end. He couldn't reveal himself, even though he knew the waitress would keep her mouth shut. He couldn't take that risk. That was why the Major pretended to be a beggar. He had managed to remain undetected, and now he was here. Alice touched him with her hand and asked quietly, "What, have I been feeding the policeman all this time?" "Yes, but you'll have to forgive me. It was necessary for the case after all," nodding, Andrew replied. At this point the guards stirred again, and the Major had to reassure them. It was an unpleasant picture, but he could not do otherwise. The director, whom the man had temporarily incapacitated by a blow to the liver, also came to his senses. He tried to break away from his seat and lunge at the Major, but ended up on the floor next to the guards as a result of the short-lived fight. Taking a portable radio from his inside pocket, Andrew called for backup. 5 minutes later, the restaurant was full of cops from all sorts of agencies. They didn't know that a drug gang leader was hiding under that name and surname. Maybe someone was covering for him, and that was why he had lived so peacefully in the city for so long. The investigators from the main directorate had yet to find out, and to find everyone involved in the case. As for the money that had disappeared from the director's safe, they looked through the cameras and found out that it had been stolen by the head of the security. He so skillfully disguised himself as a responsible and honest employee that the boss trusted him blindly, and most likely, without even knowing it, blabbed the code to the safe. Taking advantage of the temporary absence of the director, the head of security took out the money and framed the girl, but thanks to the camera placed in the dressing room, it was established who put some of the money in the locker of the former, now director of the restaurant. The leader of the gang was arrested and sent to jail, along with the head of security. A little later, the same missing employee from the headquarters also went there. The three were gathered together. They had much to think about. An investigation awaited them, but after that they faced a harsh sentence and were sent to prison. Justice, one might say, had been served. Andrew had found the ringleader of the drug dealers and, at the same time, the killer of his wife. Alice, once she learned about what he had to endure such grief, decided not to leave him for a minute. Meanwhile, after the arrest of the former director, the question arose of who would run the restaurant. After some deliberation, it was decided to give it to the major. There was no unnecessary paperwork, and a few days later, he was given a posh restaurant in the city center as compensation for the assault and murder of his wife. Naturally, the staff had questions about their future. The new owner promised to keep their jobs, and so that they had no doubts, put a girl in charge. The former waitress became the head woman and after a while brought order to the restaurant. Now all the employees received the same tip. They had an incentive and they began to work even harder, bringing the restaurant maximum profit. But after all the feelings that so suddenly engulfed the young men went nowhere, and they decided to meet to see if their emotions, which appeared against the backdrop of helping each other, were as sincere as they were. Soon the major resigned and became a civilian. He had already done much for law enforcement and had caught dangerous criminals in the first place. At least 3 men were no longer able to do their dirty deeds. As it turned out, sometime later, right in his cell, without waiting for a trial, the ringleader of the gang died. No one helped him. He did it of his own free will, except that the other 2 cellmates did not follow his example. They were scared out of their minds when they found their partner dead in the morning, and so ended the story of the search for traffickers and crooks. The chief of security was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The young men, after a while, settled in a country house not far from a lake. They had far-reaching plans and, first of all, to get married and have a child. Though the man remembered the tragedy with his first wife, he was not going to give up on himself, especially since Alice had convinced him of that. Together they went to his wife's grave to pay their respects. He proposed on the shore of that beautiful lake. A warm wind was blowing outside. They stood opposite each other and looked directly into each other's eyes. Suddenly he got down on one knee and opened a small box and took out an engagement ring. "Will you marry me?" he asked, not taking his languid gaze off her. "Yes, I agree to be your wife," she answered, and she put her arms around him and kissed him passionately on the lips. The wedding was played in the very restaurant Magnolia. All the employees were dressed in festive outfits, but at the same time they themselves laid the table and prepared the hall. It turned out just great. The wedding was attended by friends and former colleagues of the groom, and from the bride's side, Ali and the waiters. Ali even cooked delicious barbecue and brought an excellent 20-year-old wine. For 2 days, the festivities didn't stop at the restaurant. The newlyweds treated guests and those who simply came to eat. But it was time for a family routine, and the first thing the former major did was renovate the furniture in their home. He also arranged for a large sauna to be built. The family wanted them to have more frequent visitors. The wife, though orphaned, had made some friends and girlfriends during this time. Soon the girl announced her pregnancy. The couple decided not to put it off and began to prepare in advance for this event. One of the rooms in the house was remodeled as a nursery. McSchin personally supervised the way the masters made repairs, even chose the furniture himself, but still consulted his beloved. Anticipating the changes in his life, his wife began to look for a new manager. It had to be a responsible and, most importantly, honest, fair person. So Ali migrated from his booth to the spacious office and restaurant. Under his management, everything started to play with new colors. Additional dishes appeared, which were appreciated by visitors, and profits only grew. The couple was getting ready for the baby.